Hello everyone, Santir here, and welcome to part 4 of my Dark Souls 2 retrospective. Today I want to talk about, I guess, everybody's favorite point of complaint, or at least one of them, and that's talking about the world and level design. So there's a couple of different things that I want to talk about, just to kind of give you a brief overview of what I want to discuss. This is in no particular order, it's just as I wrote it down, but I want to start by talking about the design of levels or zones in particular. And then the world connections in general. And then I want to talk about something that's, I'm calling it path issues. That'll make more sense when I get to it. I also want to talk, or at least touch on the torch mechanics, bonfire ascetics, new stuff in NG+, enemies dying out, things like that. And I have a few other things that'll be coming up for demonstration purposes. So let's go ahead and just start with the first one, which is levels being... I wrote down in my notes linear, but what I really mean by that isn't so much that they are linear in terms of the paths and the connections between worlds, but what I mean is that the different parts of the game are made to be played in one direction. So let's kind of... I mean, a really good example is things betwixt, because the starting area is clearly done that way, but what I really mean by this is you're not meant to kind of wander around the zone. You're meant to, say, start here at this location in the shaded wood, and you're meant to go through it in a particular direction. And the levels are not particularly designed, nor are you incentivized to go through it in multiple directions. Now, this isn't true of every zone. I'd say places like the Salt Fort are not like that. But this game has disproportionately more parts that are like that than any of the other ones. Now, let's see. I need to pull this lever, apparently. So, this fact of the design... Oh, I did not have a shield on. Is something that really affects the feel of the game. So a lot of Dark Souls 1 is not designed to be super single directional. There are some areas that are. For example, the start of the Undead Burg. So once you go in the... or I should more accurately say, once you leave the aqueduct, it's designed to be very, very linear there. But like if you look at this zone here that I'm running through now, the shaded wood, this is very much so you're meant to go through it this direction. You're not meant to turn around and go through it this way. It's not how the game's designed. Like you can, and it doesn't prevent you here, although it does prevent you in some places from being able to go back the way you came. Which is something that can be discussed, and it's part of the linearity of the world design. But when I talk about the linearity of the level design, what I'm talking about is that this level is meant to be progressed in this direction. And so, like I was saying in Dark Souls 1 with the Undead Burg, that's a spot where... And I'm talking about the very beginning... between the Aqueduct and the Hellkite Drake's first appearance, right? That area, the game doesn't give you any reason to go through there the other way. It maybe if you're trying to get back to Firelink Shrine a little bit early, but it's to get you to an area. And this contrasts with zones where you're meant to go through it, or where you're meant to wander, or where you're meant to go through it in random orderings. So... most of this game's levels are meant to go through forward, and that decreases the feeling of exploration. This particular zone, the Shaded Wood, is especially egregious for feeling like fancy hallways. It just feels like very, very fancy hallways. And if you played the first Lords of Shadow, Castlevania Lords of Shadow game, that one was really bad about just feeling like fancy hallways. But this one, in part, it's due to the fast travel that you have immediately from the start. That you're meant to go through it in one direction. And we would see some of this in Dark Souls 1 as well. The Crystal Caves, for example, you're really only meant to go through in one direction. A lot of Ulasil is semi-like that, although it has a lot of self-referential shortcuts. That's one of the other things that this game is somewhat lacking in, is self-referential shortcuts, or shortcuts where you unlock a shortcut that allows you to get back around. There are some. A really good example is this one over here in the Forest of Fallen Giants. So right over here, this shortcut is one that you open up later. It loops back in on itself. And actually, if we come down here, there's also... Never mind the fire geckos. There's also this door right here that you open, and this creates a path through. So there's a couple of these in this game, but they're fairly uncommon. Dark Souls 1 has them a lot. Dark Souls 3 has a handful, but they also don't matter. But I'm not talking too much about Dark Souls 3 in this one. The point that I'm getting at is this fact that the individual zones, not even talking about the world, right? The individual zones are, for the most part in this game, made to be traveled through in one direction. They're hallways from one point to another. They're hallways from the entrance to the zone to the exit to the zone. A lot of zones don't have multiple connections with other zones, right? They have like a connection to this zone and then a connection to this zone, and stuff doesn't interconnect. They don't have a whole lot of internal referentiality. For example, I'm not going to go through it because I don't feel like going through this area, but the Black Gulch, very straightforward. You have the entrance, you go in, you go through, you go out. I seem to recall that being a lot of the case with the Drangleic Castle. Shrine of Amana is very much so that way. Obviously, something like the Grave of Saints and the counterpart, the Doors of Pharos, are very much so that way. So a lot of these zones, Dragon's Eyrie, Dragon Shrine, even Aldia's Keep is very much so this way. So you can see it, like, as I'm talking about and going over each zone, they are designed, that individual zone is designed to be a hallway from point A to point B, and there aren't cross directions, and because of the fast travel system that's in the game from the very start, you can have your opinions about that, but because of that system, and I guess I'll touch on it when I talk about world connections more, but because of that, you don't have a reason. The game designers do not require you to go backwards. And so this allows zones to be hallways because you don't need shortcuts within them to interlink. Because even within, like, Forest of Fallen Giants, I can warp from one of these bonfires to one of these other bonfires, right? And some of these zones have a decent number of bonfires in them, but this effect ultimately means that these are hallways that are made to go down in one direction and not the other. And that really affects the sense of the zones. To give an example of what I mean by this, it's a bit difficult, actually, just because the game itself is just so poorly designed for this. But, like, let's say we go... I guess Shrine of Amana would be a really strong example. So if we go to this last bonfire in Shrine of Amana, and we leave out this entrance, right? We come out here. How often do you walk down these stairs? How often does the player find themselves traveling this direction in Shrine of Amana? Do you even know how to navigate it backwards, ostensibly backwards, right? And the fact that the zone has a backwards is part of what I'm talking about. What I really want here, let's have less Chaos Blade and more Pyromancy Flame, just for demonstration purposes. This zone is much easier to get through, if you don't know, with a torch, because then you can actually see the ground. Like, walking through this way feels weird. The zone looks different. I guess this is the... Is this the Demon of Song boss room? I don't even remember. But the fact that these maps, like, you can, in a lot of cases, go through them this way, but that's not how they're put together, right? They're not put together with the intention that people would do that. They're not, like, just take a moment to appreciate the weirdness of this. Anyway, I think I've kind of made my point here, which is that this zone just feels super weird to go through this way. Yeah, that's fine. So, my point kind of stands here, that going through these zones backwards is just very strange, because the game never asks you to do it. And what that ends up doing is you lose out on, not an entire experience, but you lose out on like a half experience, right? The sort of partial experience of going through the zone kind of in the direction it's kind of designed for. And the fact that it's put together to be gone through a certain direction and not the other, what I'm fundamentally getting at here is they feel different when you go through them the other way. You get to know the area more intimately when you go through it multiple directions. You get to spend more time there. You get to understand the area better. You get to get an overall better feel for it. It's a different sort of experience going through zone the other way. And the fact that this game generally does not encourage that is part of what, it can make the game feel a little bit smaller, and B, it is not using the zones to the fullest of their potential. And this is something that Dark Souls 1 did very well, that players really liked. The fact that you're feeling incentivized to explore the world map much more. That each zone is really used very thoroughly for the most part. There are exceptions. And so, despite the fact that there are small parts in Dark Souls 1 where the zones are meant to be linear, again, that section from the Aqueduct to the Hellkite Drake first encounter is a really good example in Dark Souls 1, or like the cave path down to Nito, and a lot of those late game areas in general are very much so this way. Like the lava areas in Lost Izalith. They exist in Dark Souls 1, but they are the majority of Dark Souls 2. And that is a very different feel in terms of how you explore the game, how you navigate. And this is just talking about individual levels. And it's at this point that I want to get to world design. So I'm going to, I think a good way to start this, because there's a couple of different things that I want to touch on world design. So we've got a couple of obvious things. There's some nonsensical world connections that people talk about, and I do want to address those. But something else that I think would be really useful to talk about is just the way that the interconnectivity of the world. And for this, I have some graphs that I made at one point in time, and I'm going to be displaying them on screen right now so you can look at them. But you can also, I'll have a link in the description for a blog post on geekdomofgod.com where you can go check out these graphs of Souls, the Dark Souls world maps. So I have Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, and Dark Souls 3. And just for a little bit of information for reading the map, the arrow points in the direction of connectivity. So if you look at this Dark Souls 1 map that I have up right now, you can see Firelink Shrine, kind of in the lower right corner-ish, the lower right quadrant, has arrows, like bidirectional arrows going, for example, from the Undead Asylum to Firelink Shrine. That indicates that you can, from Firelink Shrine, travel to the Undead Asylum and then back again the other way. So that's in contrast to New Londo Ruins, where you see a single directional arrow to the Abyss. Because once you're in the Abyss, you can no longer travel to the New Londo Ruins. You can warp out, but warping doesn't... It's not taken into account, because technically that would link everything. So if we look at Dark Souls 1, you can see that there's a ton of interconnectivity. If you look at this graph, it is extremely complicated. Firelink Shrine has connections everywhere, including this one passing all the way through underneath Darkroot Basin to the Undead Parish, to the Lower Undead Burg, to the Undead Burg. I counted the Aqueduct as part of Firelink Shrine. So you can see how it has connections all over the place in this game. And there's some areas that don't have as many. The DLC is a really good example. That's very just within itself. But even that, like, all the areas are interlinking. Some areas, like the Painted World of Ariamis, are their own separate little things. And you can see how things dead end in this game, right? Where Anor Londo has some places you can go from it, but really it's just Anor Londo over the Duke's Archives. But if you look at somewhere like, say, Darkroot Basin or the Valley of the Drakes, these areas have lots of connections to them. Firelink Shrine is super connected to everywhere. These world connections, these loops, like, you can see a lot of loops, right? Where Undead Burg can take you to the Undead Parish, to Darkroot Forest, to Darkroot Basin, back to the Undead Burg, where these areas connect and loop around. This is something that players loved about Dark Souls 1, me included, and I really liked this world design. When we get to Dark Souls 2, what we see is there's a lot of areas. There are way more areas in this one than there are in Dark Souls 1. I think we can agree with that. But they're very isolated. You do have some commonalities. So, for example, the Lost Bastille can be gotten to through Forest of Fallen Giants or No Man's Wharf. Or, like, the Shaded Woods has a bunch of spots that link off of it, I guess. There's some things like Majula to Grave of Saints to the gutter, or Majula just straight to the gutter. But a lot of these are very straightforward, and there's a lot more single direction arrows than there are in Dark Souls 1, just because the warping allows them to not have that. So I guess I might as well take a moment here to talk about the fast travel, because this is a really good spot to talk about it. The fast travel, being able to go to the travel menu from the very start of the game, rather than having to get the Lord Vessel in Dark Souls 1. And this fact applies to Dark Souls 3 as well, which I will touch on in a moment. But this warping fundamentally changes how you build the game. You no longer have to take into consideration designing your level in a way that allows your players to get freely from place to place. You end up having far simpler world connections just because you don't need more complex ones. The other thing, too, is in Dark Souls 2 and 3, every single bonfire is warpable. You can warp to every single one of them. In Dark Souls 1, even once you do get warping, it's a select set of bonfires you can warp to. And it was increased over time, as I understand it. But when you play that game, just because you can warp from any bonfire once you get the Lord Vessel, but even having those restricted areas of fast travel keeps you in the map in a very different way. It's less convenient, but that puts pressures on their map design to handle that, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. So I'm going to go ahead and set a warp going and then bring up these maps again. So looking at this Dark Souls 2 graph, you can see that it's very spokes, very like these lead out. And that's kind of that. This effect was something that players weren't fond of. The overall design is similar to Demon's Souls in many regards, and people noted that at the time. I don't necessarily object to it, and I don't necessarily object to levels that are supposed to be straightforward, either in terms of one-directional. Again, Demon's Souls did that sort of thing. But the issue is Dark Souls 1's precedent is an interconnected world with a lot of loops back in himself. A lot of loops within the world design. And Dark Souls 2 didn't do that. Let's look at Dark Souls 3, because I think this one's also very interesting. One of the things that you'll notice is there are significantly fewer zones in this game. Now, I would argue that many of them are larger than the Dark Souls 2 zones are. That Dark Souls 2 is more segmented than Dark Souls 3. But if you look at this map, it is very simple. There's some single-directional stuff. There's a lot of bidirectional stuff. But if you look, it's a very straightforward map. And I'm mostly having it here for completion's sake, for this discussion. You're welcome to look at it and draw what conclusions you want. Now, let's address something else that players complain about a lot, which is nonsensical world connections, as I was bringing up. So I have intentionally warped here. This is the top of Earthen Peak. There's some enemies down here that hopefully won't be too much of an issue to deal with. Let's try getting past them. Okay, so now that I'm past those guys, this brings us to who even died? This brings us to the relevant point. We are currently at the top of a tower, and we can go look at that tower later if that would be instrumental or be useful. But we're now in an elevator. This is a very long elevator. Look that way. I'm going to put on a better shield while this elevator goes. One that might actually have some stability or something. That sounds like it'd be useful. Yeah, how about this tower shield? So this elevator is now done. Now you'll notice, I believe this is coming out the same way we went in. And we were at the top of Earthen Peak. And now we're here, in this molten field of lava. This is, as players have rightly discerned, absolutely ridiculous. Now, I think it would perhaps be even more instructive if I went to, say, this particular bonfire. Because if I remember correctly, yeah, we can come up here and we can look out. Now, I could not find my binoculars the other day when I was doing one of these, and that is because they are an item, they're a weapon, not another thing, and not an item. But look at this great vast field of lava. It's not... Okay, so there's some texture issues because they, who expects players to be looking at those? But you can see out, that's just a lot of lava and mountains. We're in a caldera of a volcano, excuse me. Now, if I go back to, say, here, in Earthen Peak, and get somewhere where we actually have a line of sight on the... maybe not there. Yeah. We are, let's see, at the top of that tower when we're fighting the boss. So that room I just ran through to get to the elevator that goes up is at the top of this tower, logically speaking. This obviously makes no sense. There are other areas in the game that similarly make no sense. There's a really good example of the one... I'm not going to go to it, just mention it. The one from Aldea's Keep up to the Dragon Eyrie is a really good example of this. And I believe there are a couple other particularly notable ones. One that people like to point out is going from Heide's Tower of Flame, where the water level is like that. You go down and exit out into No Man's Wharf somehow, and it's not completely underwater. So there's a bunch of these world connections that do not make any sense. It's worse than just not making sense, as I'll show you momentarily, but I just want to address this. So there's a couple of issues going on here. Now, just to state my opinion off the bat, I don't necessarily object to this nonsensicalness, but I can understand how it would be immersion breaking for some people. I've heard it said that, or heard it reported somewhere or another, that the developers from software, the people who worked on this, saw these as more... These long loading zone elevators, basically. They're loading screen elevators. They saw these as an abstraction of traveling a great distance. Now, the problem is Dark Souls 1 in particular was a very literal game about its world. It did not abstract things like that. And the closest is the Manus hand pulling you through the pass for the DLC, and that's yeah. Let's not touch that. So the this idea of abstraction, like, players are expecting things to be concrete, and the fact that these things don't make any sense was really distracting to a lot of players. I think that this game itself had a better solution, and Dark Souls 3 handled this idea better as well, in that when you don't want to have the zones have an explicit connection, you can make a warp point, basically. So in this game, you have the shrines. For example, there's the Shrine of Winter located somewhere in the Shaded Wood, I want to say. I don't remember exactly where it is, but it's in the Shaded Wood leading up towards Drangleic Castle. Or there's the shrine, the poison one, or the fire one. I don't remember all of their locations, but they're kind of after final bosses, right? And these warps, they take you somewhere, and that's an abstraction. That's a cut that lets people's brains kind of fill in whatever. So there were some bonfires in Dark Souls 3 that did this. The ones, for example, to the Dreg Heap, to the Dreg Heap in particular. That this is an abstraction. We're not literally showing you the travel, but we're indicating you are traveling somehow, right? And that's a lot more palatable to people, I think. Now, there's something that I mentioned that is even more ridiculous, and that is specifically Shaded Wood. So for this, I need to go to an external program. So I'll see you there. So, welcome to a map viewer for Dark Souls. I've tried to position this relatively well. Now, what you can see here is I have 3 zones highlighted, turned on. So let's just go and turn these off. There's Aldia's Keep. Here's Drangleic Castle and King's Passage. So this right here is the Shaded Wood. Let me drag this over a bit. So it's the Shaded Wood and the Shrine of Winter. And so you can see, I guess, here, the controls are a little wonky. So right here is where you enter in, you travel through here. Here's the Shrine of Winter. Okay, so that's not where you enter in. I guess you enter in over here, yeah. You travel up this way. You saw me rest here. This leads off up towards the King's area. No, this leads towards the King's area. This leads off towards Aldia's Keep. And this is the Shaded Wood area itself. And we navigate through here. I guess, yeah, the boss is over here, right? Inside this space. Sorry, the controls are... They leave something to be desired. Okay, so this here is the Shaded Wood. If I can get this oriented in a way that we can... Okay, this is acceptable. Okay, so let's look at what happens when I turn on Aldia Keep. Oh, Aldia's Keep pops in right here. It looks like Aldia's Keep, from a technical connection standpoint, passes right through the Shaded Wood area and the boss fight with Nashka, I think it is. It's been a while, guys. And you can see this is where the dragon is fought. You can see this is like it's just a super hallway area. And in fact, this outdoor area, like if I turn off Shaded Wood, this area is that sort of front entrance, and this is the area where the dragon skull and stuff comes flying down. The Shaded Wood actually intersects in that. Like, if you connect those areas together, they intersect. And here's Drangleic Castle. It also intersects. So if I turn off Aldia's Keep, you can see it sort of intersects, like, right here. Like, this area leading off. And I imagine if I turn on the Doors of Pharos, yeah, you can see that, like, passing right through. Like, if I turn off Drangleic Castle, there's Doors of Pharos, right? That's right in the middle of Drangleic Castle. So if I turn Doors of Pharos back off, like, that also intersects with Aldia's Keep. And like, if I turn off the Shaded Wood, here it is, you can see that these areas are super intersecting in the way that they're logically positioned in the world. This is bonkers. Like, this, from a logical world standpoint, this does not make any sense. Now, we can turn on some more areas and see how they kind of overlap with things. In particular, I would be interested if I have it in this list. Yeah, here's Harvest Valley and Earthen Peak. Now it's going to be off in its own place over here. So you can see this area right here, and then the Iron Keep is just right here. So you can see though that if I, these controls are so awkward. But you can see like that's coming through there. There's the sort of outside of the tower. I know we're sideways, which is not good. But here, let's try reset view. Oh, thanks. That's actually kind of helpful. So you can see how that links up. But this massive overlap of areas is absolutely ridiculous. There's Majula, Forest of Fallen Giants, Brightstone Cove, Seldora. Again, it's kind of overlapping with stuff a little bit. So this amount of overlapping and just the way that the world is presented is just absolutely ridiculous. And it creates for a very strange sort of thing if you actually think about it. Most players aren't going to worry about this. Most players just aren't going to care about this, but they might care about the elevators. Some people are going to care about this nonsense. While I actually have this open, there's something that I want to point out in Drang Lake Castle, just because I think it's worth looking at. This is more of a specific level design thing. So Drang Lake Castle has in it, I think I might need to turn on, nope, it's on. Okay. So let's see if I can figure out where it is. Okay, you can kind of see it here. Right here's the Throne of Want area. This is the staircase or the ramp leading up to the final boss fight, right? And if I maybe backface calling, yeah, if I turn backface calling on, that turns off a lot of those spots. This right here, I called this the Walk of Shame. This is where you enter it. It travels all the way down here, all the way over to here. If you look at it, this right here, okay, just talking about level design, this right here is the path that you have to take, right? The bonfire's like right over here, and you have to take this whenever you lose to the final boss to get back. This is why it feels like it takes so long to get back there, because look at how long this is. Like, it's the entire length of, like, this. Like, so much of this level is the same sort of length. So it's just absolutely ridiculous. So, anyway, I wanted to talk about some of these things. Jumping back into the game. So that's some of the nonsensical connections, some of the weird overlap, some of these things that, like, some of it matters, some of it really doesn't, and how much it matters is going to be dependent upon the player. But I think it's worth talking about in this review. I think it's worth looking at because here's the thing that really matters here. Dark Souls 1 set a precedent, and this is going back to that very first episode. This game did not follow that precedent. It did not follow the precedent in level design. It did not follow the precedent in world design. And what they did, I don't necessarily think is bad, but it is different. And that created a lot of consternation. I do think there's an issue with presenting your game in a slightly more realistic sense, like the Souls games tend to be presented in, and having abstracted away travel with elevators. But that's a different sort of matter. The overall issue, I think, with a lot of these for a lot of people. Let's go ahead and go back to Majula here. Nice, pretty place. Is that the level design really let people down. The world design really let people down because it was not what they were used to. It was not what they were expecting. Is the problem. And that's what I mean by used to, right? They were expecting Dark Souls 1 type level design, and they did not get that. They did not get that at all. And that was hugely disappointing. And you can see how that plays out with some of these things. By the way, there's lots of deaths worldwide. Just want to point that out. That's 366,191,239 as of this moment. Anyway, there's a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about as well. So I want to talk about something that I'm calling path issues. This is specifically for Magic. So let's go ahead and just bring up that connection map again, right? That connection map, it shows something. So let's take a moment to look at this. So we start the game in Majula. Now let's say we want to use magic. Any type of magic. So there are 4 types of magic in the game, 4 classes, right? There are hexes, which are kind of like a hybrid version of either a variant on a sorcery or a miracle, but they are their own distinct thing. So let's say you want to use one of those. Where do you have to go? Well, you have to go to Heide's Tower of Flame. You have to defeat the boss there, so that way you can get the NPC to open or to turn the path, or to kill her to get the key to turn the path, to be able to go into the Huntsman's Copse area, just the very first part of it, to get to the Hex Trainer there. So if you want to start training hexes, that's how you have to do it. Let's say you want to do miracles. Well, you need to go to Heide's Tower of Flame and defeat the boss there, because that's where the NPC is that teaches miracles, who also opens the door to get to hexes. Okay. Well, let's say you want to learn sorcery. Maybe you can go a different direction. Nope. If you wanted to learn sorcery, the sorcery trainer is No Man's Wharf, which is just beyond Heide's Tower of Flame. And once you beat the boss of No Man's Wharf, you get a pyromancy flame, as I recall, from the chest there at the end. So that's critical. That's key for doing pyromancies. Now, the pyromancy trainer is technically off in a slightly different direction in Shaded Woods, but you need a branch to be able to unlock her. So what's my point with all of this? In Dark Souls 1, first of all, miracles are very differently scattered around the game. But your principal trainers are Petrus, who's in Firelink Shrine, the very starting area, and then Rhea down in the Tomb of the Giants, eventually. If you want to learn sorceries, you first need to go to the Lower Undead Burg. And you can get a couple off of Rickert also very early on in the game. Just off of Firelink Shrine. So, again, what we're seeing with those, just off of Firelink Shrine, and are basically at Firelink Shrine for like some very initial stuff. Later areas to kind of build up some of these. Pyromancies, you need to go to Laurentius, down in the depths to be able to get him back to Firelink Shrine. So my point with this is, in Dark Souls 2, every single spellcasting teacher requires you to be able to get to them to go through Heide's Tower of Flame. And they're all in that direction. There's none down in the Gutter, or the Grave of Saints, or the Black Gulch, or any of those directions. There's technically one at the start of Shaded Woods. That's a little bit of a late game area anyway. There are none off in the Forest of Fallen Giants. Everything filters you through Heide's Tower of Flame if you want to do magic. This means that if you want to do a magic playthrough, you're going to find yourself most likely repeating the exact same path again and again and again for each one of those casting playthroughs. That's the path problem that I'm talking about. The fact that all of the magic teachers are basically along the same route. Pyromancy is a little bit different, but you still need the flame at the end of No Man's Wharf. And so if you want to do magic, that's the way you got to go. And that's frustrating. That's an issue. So I think that's worth bringing up. When you're designing something like this, particularly, so Dark Souls 2 is a game that wants you to replay it. All of the Dark Souls games are really kind of built for being replayed experiences. And Dark Souls 1 gives you a lot of variety and direction that you can go. If you want to do magic in that one, depending upon the type of magic that you want to do, you do have a little bit of variety in terms of how you go through it. There is a little bit of linearity with that, but that's it's differently paced and all of these sorts of things. And that different pacing helps break up some of that. Dark Souls 2 makes it very clear. It has a lot of directions you could go at the start, but the only one that really matters is Heide's Tower of Flame. You have to head that way if you want to do magic. It would have been really nice if, say, Carillion of the Fold, for example, was off in the Forest of Fallen Giants. That's all I'm saying. Like, that, if the Hex guy was down in the Gutter or something, like, if these guys were broken up in which direction they were, that would mean that if you're trying to go for a specific type of spellcasting, that you find yourself naturally led in different directions to start the game. And that helps enhance replayability. And that's something to keep in mind. If you have build paths for people to go on in your game, you should, in my opinion, design your game to encourage the players to take different paths. So this game doesn't do that, and that's something that I find very disappointing. So something else that I wanted to touch on briefly was torch mechanics. Overall, one of the biggest problems with these is the design of the game and the technical capabilities of the target platforms were a bit of a mismatch. I don't want to dwell too long on this here, but when we look at the torches, I kind of like the idea of lighting a torch. Like, I like the idea of what they're trying to do with it. That you have to... there we go. That you have to collect torch time, that you can run out of torch time, that you're going to be ending up in dark areas, that you lose some of your defensive capabilities by holding out a torch. It's a fine idea, and there's a lot of practicalities for holding a torch, lighting torches and being able to light stuff. All of this is a really cool idea. The fundamental problem is the hardware they're targeting, the 360 and the PS3, were not able to handle the lighting system that they had put together. They should have figured that out ahead of time. They should have planned around it. They should have done more testing for all that sort of stuff to be able to determine before putting in a lot of mechanics that kind of didn't work out as well as people expected them to, as they themselves were hoping. It's just an unfortunate side effect of how things work. So I think it's a really interesting idea that I wish had been executed better. I do like what they're trying to do with it. That's really all about it. Really all I have to say about it, I guess, when it kind of comes down to it. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was Bonfire Ascetics and new stuff in New Game Plus. This was awesome. I really liked the idea of what they're trying to do with integrating the idea of New Game into this much better and much more thoroughly. It's an idea that adds longevity to the game. The fact that new items can pop up in New Game Plus, that you get, just to show, like, these are, plus versions of rings. New stuff appears to be able to pick up in the world when you get, like, here's Ring of Resistance +1. Like, that's really cool. I really like that they did that sort of thing. I really like that they added that sort of stuff. Obviously, it takes time to develop it, but they intended for this game to be one that people would do multiple New Game Plus runs through, and they added Bonfire Ascetics to be able to incentivize that idea of the game gets harder and these sorts of things. I think this is a really cool idea. I really like the idea of how they implemented it too, with, like, ascetics will respawn wooden chests but not steel ones, so there's a difference between asceticing and New Game Plusing, I guess, starting a new game. These are things that I think were really cool. I really like that they added these things. I think that's really neat. A neat direction to go in, and I appreciate that they did. So, the final thing that I wanted to talk about is just a small mechanic, but it's enemies dying out. So, if you aren't somehow familiar with this fact, I know that there's some locations where this has happened in this world, but I'm not sure off the top of my head where they are. If you kill an enemy enough times, it will no longer spawn. Now, you can get the enemies back by using a Bonfire Ascetic or going to New Game Plus, which the enemies dying out incentivizes those things. But this is something that I'm personally kind of neutral on. I think it's overall fairly cool. That's right, that makes me smack with my shield. So if I kill this guy, say, enough times, he will stop appearing. This is, like I said, this is a mechanic that they added to the game, and it was a mixed bag. I know people who liked it. I have a friend who, like, the only reason why he beat this game, the fact that they don't have leave the bonfire as the first option there is a little interesting. Anyway, I have a friend who only beat the game because he could kill off all of the enemies and have them not respawn. The fact that he could do that made him able to beat the game. But I had another friend, so he liked it. But I have another friend who it made him feel even worse when he lost a bloodstain because it felt like souls were a finite resource in the game. That if he just went through and he killed out all of the enemies, that the fact that they wouldn't respawn anymore, or that there's a limited number of spawns per enemy, made it feel to him like there's a finite number of souls, and that it made it, when he lost a bloodstain, it made it very, very punishing. It made it feel like he really lost something much more profoundly, and it made him it made the game much more stressful for him. And so it negatively impacted his play experience, I would say. So your mileage varies on that. I will say, as a mechanic, I like what it's doing. First of all, as I said, they have a lot of emphasis on New Game Plus and Bonfire Ascetics. Like, there's a lot of emphasis on this concept in this game. And so the fact that they have enemies dying out as a way of incentivizing you to do those things, I really appreciate that. I really appreciate what it's doing from a design standpoint. Aha, take that, my giant shield. I don't know how many more spawns this guy has. There's around 9 a dozen, something like that. And I don't know how many times I've killed this guy. But one other thing that I really like about this mechanic is it emphasizes, yep, he's gone. See, he's not here anymore. He won't spawn anymore because I've killed him out. I've just killed him off. And that's that. It emphasizes the idea of the world fading, the world dying away. And as you go through it, as you make your way through it, as you kill enemies, most of them just stop reappearing. Sometimes that's to your benefit, sometimes that's to your detriment. Now, it's not completely true that enemies will completely 100% die out. There are some enemies that do infinitely respawn. Notably, the stone soldiers in Dragon Lake Castle that you can farm Titanite slabs from do not have a spawn limit. But this feeling of the world fading away, of it's slowly becoming empty of enemies, it's a very poignant feeling that this game has. And I like what it's doing. I like the way, narratively, it reinforces... I just like the tower there. It narratively reinforces the idea of the world fading away and falling apart, and becoming lifeless and dead and ruined. And I like that. I like what it does for it. I really like what it does for the narrative to have the enemies have limited spawns. But in terms of player experience, it obviously varies. So anyway, I think that's most of what I wanted to talk about today. So I have mostly covered most of the big topics. There are a few odds and ends that I'll want to talk about. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. And until next time, everyone, take care. Goodbye.